Section 26 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CDOB7 from Cincinnati, Ohio. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1, Section 26. Section F. Activities regarding the elderly. Subsection 1. Use of federal resources. The evidence the committee has gathered indicates that federal resources were employed to secure the support of older Americans. Exhibit number 36 is a November 9, 1972 memorandum from Webster Dan Todd, director of the CRP Older Americans Voter Bloc Group, to then campaign director Clark McGregor. This document, which is a final report on campaign activities respecting the elderly, states under the heading Strong Points, quote, I doubt if there has ever before been such a massive effort by a political organization to involve itself directly in the daily lives of so many. This effort, of course, can only be accomplished by an incumbent situation and the available resources of the administration through Arthur Fleming. Elliot Richardson and the Domestic Affairs Council were maximized. Elsewhere in the same memorandum, Todd refers to an extensive and coordinated use of USG resources. Subsection A. Government brochures. Todd, in a staff interview, stated that several departments and agencies prepared for campaign use and at government expense brochures reflecting their services for the elderly. Todd stated that the requests for these brochures originated with him, but were funneled through the Domestic Council. Todd was unaware whether the departments and agencies involved had perceived that the requests actually came from CRP. Various documents obtained by the Select Committee also indicate that government brochures were prepared for political purposes. Evans Exhibit Number 6 is an April 14, 1972 document entitled Proposed Communications Support Program for Older Americans Division Committee for the Re-election of the President. Under subsection E, entitled Brochures/Direct Mail, the following entry appears. Quote, Government agencies, each agency who has senior citizen programs, will be asked to produce an informational brochure stating just exactly what the agency can do for older Americans. One will be released every 2 weeks, beginning September 1. The agencies who will be asked to participate are Action, HUE, HUD, DOT, OEO, Agriculture, Labor. Unquote. On the cover of this document, Todd wrote, quote, Gangbusters, let's make it happen. It appears that at least HUE, HUD, DOA, DOL, Action, OEO, and VA actually produce brochures. Copies of these brochures are contained in Exhibit Number 38. The Comptroller General has stated that the costs of producing and mailing the DOA, HUD, DOL, Action, OEO, and VA brochures totaled around $263,000. The Comptroller General noted that these 6 publications were distributed in accordance with lists and preprinted mailing labels supplied by the White House. He also reported the assertions of various agency officials that this was the first time a concerted effort to produce a number of aging brochures had been made by an incumbent administration. Other campaign and White House documents strongly suggest the political purpose behind the brochures. On June 7, 1972, William Novelli of CRP wrote a confidential memorandum entitled Government White Papers and Brochures on Older Americans to Todd and L.J. Evans. This memorandum is a review of the brochures project as of that date and also contains suggestions as to how to proceed. Under the heading Background, Novelli wrote, quote, We are all in agreement that brochures produced and distributed by government departments and agencies will be important in persuading older voters to re-elect the president. These brochures will be nonpartisan enough to break through the election year aversion to political rhetoric, but will be strongly supportive of the president. Unquote. After outlining his views as to the contents of the brochures, Novelli, under the heading Distribution, Timing, and Coordination, stated, quote, The agencies and departments should be requested to develop the brochures immediately, along with a plan for mass distribution. We can indirectly check copy and also stagger the release of the brochures to ensure a steady stream between now and late September. Unquote. Exhibit number 40 is an August 4, 1972 CRP memorandum for Clark McGregor from Fred Malek, entitled Older Americans' Progress. Under the caption Administration Support, Malek stated, quote, "The Older Americans Project team has been particularly imaginative in the use of administration resources to support the re-election. Specifically, they have arranged for each department and agency with programs that help the elderly to develop and distribute a brochure that explains these programs. The first of the brochures, Department of Agriculture, is off the presses, and mentions the president prominently. Not surprising, since we control the content of each brochure. This brochure and subsequent ones will be direct mailed to approximately 1 million persons." Unquote. Mr. Evans, in his executive session before the committee on May 28, 1974, vigorously denied that he perceived the primary purpose for these brochures as political. The main goal, he said, was to inform the elderly of the benefits and programs available to them, and, he contended, the brochures were mainly informational, not political. He stated that the idea for most of these brochures evolved in 1971, before aging activists at CRP materialized. He said he made no attempt to stagger distribution of brochures for political benefit, although he felt it would be advantageous if periodic distribution eventuated. He conceded that others in the White House and CRP may have supported the preparation of brochures mainly for political reasons, but emphasized that this was not his chief motivation. He stated that his memorandums regarding these publications often sound in political terms because he was trying to convince others to support this project. These comments by Evans should be compared with the remarks in May 23, 1972, Confidential Eyes Only memorandum written by him to Todd and others on the subject, government brochures. Quote, "I have been informed of disgruntlement expressed at this morning's breakfast concerning the development of government aging brochures. So that we will be united in our efforts to make this a successful program on behalf of the President, I would like to take your time to review the history regarding the development of these brochures. In late February, Chuck Colson and I decided that the departments and agencies involved with aging were not letting older voters know, as well as they should or could, what was being done by the President on their behalf. One of the vehicles we decided to utilize to overcome this was the development of a series of pamphlets for mass distribution." The record contains a number of other exhibits authored by Evans indicating political motivations behind these brochures. While these are collected at Evans Exhibit numbers 7 through 16, a few illustrations are useful here. Thus, in response to Todd's requests of July 14 and 24, 1972 as to a schedule for production and publication of certain brochures, Evans responded on July 24 with a detailed schedule indicating when each of the brochures then under consideration would be mailed. And on July 27, he sent Malek, then at CRP, a memorandum that read, quote, "Attached is the first government aging brochure to come off the printing press. It still has a slight bureaucratic flavor to it, but I think it gets across the President's concerns as well as emphasizes help in solving the problems of older persons. The original mailing will distribute 950,000 of these brochures. This will leave us 550,000 remaining brochures for distribution to senators and congressmen, field organizations, and other groups that may want to reach. We will be sending out 7 additional brochures at a rate of approximately 1 every 2 weeks, and I will forward these to you as they come off the press." Unquote. Evans explained his memorandum stating the distribution of the brochures would be staggered for maximum impact with the assertion that, since it appeared the brochures would be inadvertently be finalized at different times, he told those interested that they would produce at intervals to reduce the pressure from those persons concerned with political impact. Evans also reported to Colson on these brochures as reflected in a June 30, 1972 weekly staff report. Colson wrote "Excellent" by Evans's account of the progress of these publications. Colson, however, apparently became concerned about the political nature of the brochures. An unsigned memorandum to Malek, dated August 3, states in part, quote, "Danny called this AM and said that Evans told him at breakfast today that, quote, Colson is having second thoughts, cold feet, about the 7 additional brochures," unquote. Apparently Volpe called Colson and said DLT didn't want to do a brochure, too political, with a quote from P on the cover, etc., and this must have gotten Colson thinking. Danny is quite alarmed and just wanted you to be aware of the above in case he makes a desperate plea to get you to put in a strong call to Coulson to get him to back off." Unquote. It appears that DOT did not produce a brochure, but the other 6 pamphlets involved with this note, those from HUD, DOA, DOL, Action, OEO, and VA, were prepared and distributed. Evans earlier had entertained doubts concerning the government production of brochures that were too political in nature. Exhibit number 39 is a March 16, 1972 confidential memorandum from Evans to Todd entitled Older American Pamphlets, which sets out various options for the preparation of a brochure entitled The President Speaks to Older Americans, Again, which was to consist entirely of quotations from and photographs of the President. Evans recognized in this memorandum that the preparation of a political pamphlet by GPO could result in a charge that, quote, "the Republicans got the GPO to do its campaign literature." He also noted that the purchase of a government pamphlet for use by the campaign organization would have to be made through some dummy organization to avoid the contention that the pamphlet was political. Subsection B. Other uses of government funds. The Evans to Coulson weekly staff report referenced above contains other examples of proposed expenditures of federal funds for what appear to be primarily campaign purposes. At page 2, Evans wrote, quote, "It appears that Hugh has agreed to produce 60 copies of the Richardson-Fleming Roca TV program taping. This will then be distributed simultaneously to the top TV stations in all of our key states. It is a very political show, which stresses time and time again the fantastic things the President has done for older people, which is why the need for simultaneous distribution. This should be shown in late July or early August. In any event, it will be shown before the President is nominated." Unquote. There is a handwritten good by this entry written by Coulson. This document also comments that, with Malek's help, an individual, paid by Hugh, would be brought on board to act as Arthur Fleming's scheduling advancement from now until the election. An earlier memorandum from Evans to Malek indicates that this individual was hired as a consultant to Hugh, and suggests that he maintain close ties with the tour office at the re-election committee. Subsection 2. The Federation of Experienced Americans. Particularly significant are the administration's activities concerning the Federation of Experienced Americans. This organization, which was created on March 29, 1972 on White House initiative, was the recipient in 1972 of 2 major federal awards. Number 1, a DOL contract for $1,540,000 for services from June 30, 1972 to January 31, 1974 to train and provide work for 350 poor elderly persons. And 2, an OEO grant of $399,839 for the period November 1, 1972 to February 28, 1974 for developing new methods to overcome the special problems of the Spanish-speaking elderly poor. The GAO concerning these 2 awards has now concluded that, quote, "the grant and contract awards were processed outside normal procedures." Officials of Labor and OEO said that both the grant and the contract had substantial White House backing. Unquote. As to the Labor Department contract, the GAO report, page 13, contained the following statement, quote, "The former Assistant Secretary, Malcolm R. Lovell, Jr., advised us that the White House took an active role in directing the Labor Department as to how the expansion monies were to be spent. The White House staff member involved was identified as L.J. Evans, Jr., according to former Assistant Secretary. The White House wanted the $13 million in expansion monies to go to organizations considered friendly to the administration. Labor's initial allocation plan did not satisfy this requirement, and according to former Assistant Secretary, Mr. Evans and the former Executive Assistant to the Assistant Secretary, Brad Bearden, worked out a compromise plan which called for awarding a $1 million contract to an organization to be selected by the White House. This occurred on February 1972. Unquote. The GAO report continues, quote, "The former executive assistant told us the White House wanted Labor to cut back and or terminate funding for 2 of the Operation Mainstream national contractors, the National Council on the Aging and the National Council of Senior Citizens. Funding to these 2 contractors, considered enemies of the White House, was not terminated by DOL, even though the record shows that on February 28, 1972, they were given substantially less funding than the amounts originally recommended on December 18, 1971, by Robert J. Brown, Associate Manpower Administrator for the U.S. Training and Employment Service. However, the White House-sponsored FEA, which was not incorporated until March 29, 1972, did receive a $1 million-plus contract to begin on June 30, 1972. The GAO also found White House involvement concerning the OEO grant. Its report reads in pertinent part, quote, "An OEO official advised us that a White House staff member, L.J. Evans, Jr., directed OEO to fund the proposal from FEA, which was for a major project concerning elderly Spanish-speaking people. OEO officials told us that Mr. Evans also instructed OEO to limit its forthcoming contract extension with the National Council on the Aging and the National Council of Senior Citizens be expected to award a grant or contract to FEA to provide a full range of professional training and technical assistance for OEO aging programs that have been provided by the National Council on the Aging for many years with funds from OEO and other agencies." Continuing, "The executive assistant told us the FEA proposal was first brought to his attention by the OEO deputy director and that he met FEA's president at the initial meeting at Mr. Evans's office. He said that, after OEO received the proposal, Mr. Evans telephoned him to express his support for FEA, and then had frequent contact with him until the grant was awarded." Unquote. A memorandum to the record dated November 17, 1972, by Irvin M. Eitring, Chief Older Persons Program, Office of Operations, OEO, sets out at length his views of the circumstances surrounding the FEA award. Quote, "All of the circumstances surrounding the processing and awarding of the above grant have been so irregular that I am taking this means to record and document some of these circumstances to protect myself and perhaps some other people within the agency in the event of possible future embarrassing disclosures. I was informed by a staff member of the Office of Program Review in the early part of September that, number 1, the agency had been ordered by a junior White House staff member to fund a proposal from the Federation of Experienced Americans, an outfit of which I have never heard of, despite my intimate familiarity with all recognized national organizations in the aging field, to conduct a major program concerned with elderly Spanish-speaking people. Number 2, that the same White House staff member had instructed OEO to limit its forthcoming contract extension, effective September 24, with the National Council on the Aging, to a 6-month period after which we would be expected to award a grant or contract to the Federation of Experienced Americans to provide the full range of professional training and technical assistance that for our aging programs have been provided by NCOA over a period of years." Continuing, "Late on the afternoon of October 30, I was given a copy of a letter from David Brody, president of FEA, dated October 20, which contained some modifications of the work plan and a loosely constructed budget amounting to a few dollars under $400,000. I was told the grant must be completely processed and signed by the end of the following day, October 31. I was informed that the work program and budget were to be accepted as presented with no further opportunity for negotiating work or budget provisions. At a small briefing session on the morning of October 31, conducted in the atmosphere of conspiracy and attended by Brody, we were told that the normal agency requirement for review board approval had been waived, that normal approval of the mayor of Washington and certain governors would be handled informally, and perhaps by telephone, and that standard procedures for announcing the grant were to be bypassed, at least for the time being. Continuing, in summary, I have the following reservations about this grant. Number 1, I consider the grantee to be totally unqualified to do the job. Number 2, I think the grant can produce nothing that is not already well researched and tested. It is a weak, poorly developed plan and inappropriate for the use of Section 252 funds. Number 3, the budget of $399,839 is grossly excessive. A planning grant of this nature should not exceed $75,000 to $90,000. Number 4, the urgency and secrecy with which the grant was pushed through were highly irregular. Never in my long experience in the federal government have I experienced anything approaching the impropriety of this grant transaction. Number 5, I sense that I have been used as a professional program specialist and titular head of the OEO's Older Persons Program and as a veteran civil servant to give this grant some semblance of legitimacy, and suspect that my professional reputation may be damaged as a result. Number 6. I am appalled by the remaining possibility that we may have to award a grant or contract to FEA for the highly complex and sophisticated professional T and TA services needed by our aging program grantees. FEA does not have and cannot within a period of several years, if ever, acquire an acceptable degree of competence to perform these functions. I am convinced this course would be utterly destructive to our aging programs. An award to FEA for this purpose would offend the entire aging constituency in the country, knowledgeable members of both parties in the Congress, and our own CAAs and SES programs. No service at all would be preferable to a contract with FEA, both from the programmatic and political standpoints." Unquote. It appears that Dan Todd was also concerned about the White House sponsorship of FEA. In a handwritten memorandum to Malik, apparently prepared after the Watergate break-in June 17, 1972, but before June 30, 1972, Todd stated, quote, "The Federation of Experienced Americans has become a matter of great concern to those of us working the elderly. I have done as much legwork as is possible from my position and believe the matter now deserves fast attention from higher up. Number 1. I anticipate an extremely unfavorable reaction among aging organizations when this group begins to move, such that it could totally undermine the President's credibility with OAs and cost considerable votes. Number 2. Involvement of White House personnel in questionable activities involving $1 million of USG funds funneled through dubious outsiders could make the Watergate episode look tiny. This has every potential of a major scandal, if not brought under control. Number 3. ASF wants to talk directly with Secretary Hodgson as DOL funds are involved. Once he does this, I'm afraid the whole thing will become public. All that I have are allegations, nothing that would stand up in court, but this will be aimed at the press, where proof isn't needed, particularly fonding ITT and Watergate. I urge your attention to this matter. I've done all I can for my shop. If there is any possibility, I would recommend that the grant be canceled." Unquote. In hand on this document, Malik wrote, "Discuss with Colson," and "What does Evans say to all of this?" Todd, in a staff interview, stated that Malik told him Colson had advised that FEA was a legitimate organization. Todd, however, continues to be disturbed by the FEA matter, as demonstrated by memorandums from him to Malik on this subject on September 11 and November 6, 1972. The June 30 weekly staff report to Colson from Evans also reflects Todd's concern and reveals a White House purpose to injure anti-administration organizations receiving federal funding. Quote, "I have met with Malik concerning the new aging organization, and he was very impressed and very cooperative in getting his guys to move out and assuring us funding at our foes' expense. However, after having chatted with Todd, he raised cries of alarm that such an organization would hurt us politically because we would cut funds to Democratic groups, thereby leading them to criticize us. As you are well aware, groups like NCSC are going to criticize us anyway. Unfortunately, while I told Todd about the organization in confidence, he immediately told Fleming, who was particularly upset, and called Malik. Malik seemed to understand the value of the organization and is still working with us, but I have had to do some shoring operations with Fleming. I don't think this requires any action on your part, but you should be aware of it." Unquote. Colson wrote in hand by this entry, "Keep Malik on board." Mr. Evans confirmed in his testimony that he was involved to some degree in the process leading to the DOL and OEO awards. He denied, however, that he had directed either DOL or OEO to fund FEA, while admitting that he expressed his views that funding would be desirable. Evans claimed he lacked the power to direct either institution to make an award. He also denied that he attempted to induce DOL and OEO to terminate or cut back existing funding to the National Council on Aging or the National Council of Senior Citizens, but did concede that he endeavored to limit any additional funding they might receive. GAO has conducted a programmatic review of FEA's DOL contract. It concluded that, in significant respects, FEA's operations were ineffective, deficient, or in violation of its DOL contract. GAO also performed a financial review of FEA's activities regarding both the DOL contract and the OEO grant. It concluded that FEA's accounting system and related internal controls were inadequate. As a result of these deficiencies, GAO questioned the expenditures of approximately $184,000 under the DOL contract and $30,000 under the OEO grant. Both DOL and OEO have concluded that it would not be in the best interest of the government to refund FEA's present programs. Section G. Other related activities. Subsection 1. Conduct at the Veterans Administration. The Select Committee is in receipt of information indicating that in late 1971 and 1972, efforts were taken to politicize the Veterans Administration for purposes of the President's re-election. This information, which has been verified in all significant respects by the Select Committee, was first supplied to the committee by Senator Alan Cranston, chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and Hospitals of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. A complete report on the subcommittee's investigation is found at Exhibit Number 48. It appears that in late 1971, Glenn C. Wallace, then Special Assistant to the Administrator, solicited $100 contributions for the President's election campaign from VA employees on federal facilities. The contributions were in connection with a $1,000 a plate dinner held to pay tribute to the President. The contribution of $100 gave the contributor the chance to draw for one of the 2 tickets to the dinner that, besides the ticket reserved for the administrator, were available to VA personnel. The evidence collected by the Cranston Subcommittee also indicates that the administrator, Donald Johnson, held a meeting in early 1972 of top VA officials, where he indicated to those present that key officials in the agency would be expected to lend their full support to the re-election effort, including participation in campaign activities, and that the affairs of the agency until the election would be conducted with a partisan consideration in mind. Documents obtained by the subcommittee indicate that the VA was to some degree politicized during the 1972 campaign. Exhibit number 49 is an undated document from CRP files concerning campaign plans for veterans leaders, apparently prepared by or for the Veterans Committee to re-elect the President. This document, at page 20, under the heading Administration and Initiatives and Activities, states, Veterans Administration. The VA is the point of contact for all civilian veterans who utilize any government veteran benefits and has received favorable responses from Vietnam-era veterans for their programs to assist returning veterans in recent years. Because of these factors, the VA will be the primary agency used in the governmental effort to win the support of veterans. The VA administrator and designated officials within his agency will be responsible for executing the VA communications activities presented in the communications plan. The VA will develop program activities in the medical and education areas and coordinate with labor and the Presidential Advisory Group on employment activities to focus attention on government initiatives to aid the veteran. The VA will review major construction announcements, grants, opening of new facilities, and legislative actions, and coordinate communication plans for these items with the committee. The VA will recommend program initiatives and action on special veterans issues and plan these activities with the committee." Unquote. Exhibit number 50 is an updated final report for the CRP Veterans Division found in CRP files. At page 4 it states, quote, "The campaign staff's effectiveness was significantly enhanced by its close liaison with the Veterans Administration and coordination of campaign activity with the agency. Frequent contact and planning with the administrator of the VA to place spokesmen and start action programs made possible a positive veterans program throughout the campaign." Unquote. Subsection 2. The Surrogate Program Advanced School. The evidence shows that in early 1972, an advanced school in connection with the surrogate candidate program was held in the Executive Office Building under the direction of Bart Porter, head of the CRP surrogate program. The 50 to 75 attendees were mainly Schedule C government employees from various departments and agencies. Schedule C employees are subject to the Hatch Act, which forbids certain government employees from participating in political campaigns. There is evidence that the purpose of the advanced school was to train these employees for political missions. The advanced manual for the surrogate program, which is distributed at the school, states at page 4, quote, "You should never lose sight of the political purpose of the trip and the fact that the actual events are in many cases only a vehicle for a more important purpose, namely, exposure of the administration's views to aid the president's re-election, unquote. The Select Committee has received evidence regarding several instances where hatched government employees advanced or accompanied surrogates on political trips. It is significant that FCRP paid all bills for surrogates and their aides on campaign trips, thus underlining the political nature of events in which hatched government employees were involved. However, according to John Faust, who on April 15, 1972 joined CRP as chief of the advance team, advances handled by his office after that date were only performed by CRP employees or persons in private life. Subsection 3. Activities regarding military voters. Exhibit number 52 is a July 12, 1972 administratively confidential memorandum from John Grinaldus, then a major in the U.S. Marine Corps, and a White House Fellow, to Frederick Malek concerning military voters. Sets out a strategy for maximizing the president's support within that constituency. Attached to that memorandum is a recommended action plan for career military voter groups. The following entry appears in that plan. Quote, Action step number 4. Surrogate speakers on military bases. DoD officials and U.S. congressmen. Purpose. To congratulate achievements of career military officers and NCOs on Vietnamization success and highlight President Nixon's leadership in process. Responsible organization. Committee, McAdoo, in cooperation with the executive branch, Colson, and Hill Party leadership. Concept of execution. Committee will select most populous bases, then set up schedule with defense for their officials and U.S. congressmen from their respective states to visit the bases in September or October and tell the career force, who served in Vietnam, about how the president and the country appreciate their efforts and sacrifices in bringing about Vietnamization. Strong highlight on President Nixon. Cost should be nil since it should be charged off as official business. Unquote. Malek indicated his approval on this proposal on the document, but added the following comment in hand, but discussed with Porter first. As noted, Bart Porter was in charge of CRP surrogate program. Mr. Richard McAdoo, who is referenced in this document, has informed the Select Committee that no surrogate speakers were actually sent to military bases. End of section 26. Recording by CDOB7 from Cincinnati, Ohio.
Section 27 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Final Report of the Senate's Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Chapter 3, Use of Incumbency, Responsiveness Program, Part 7. 6. Resistance in the bureaucracy to the responsiveness concept. As the previous section demonstrates, the results of the responsiveness program were many and varied. But the successes of the program were reduced because there was considerable resistance in the federal establishment to bending the system to fit re-election purposes. Without attempting to be exhaustive, the following examples give a flavor of the recalcitrance of some federal officials to requests made of them by White House and campaign officials. A. The failure of the departments and agencies to submit responsiveness plans. The basic document presenting the responsiveness concept, the Malek and Haldeman Memorandum of March 17, 1972, stated that the departments would be required to submit plans to the White House outlining the ways in which each department could respond to re-election needs. Accordingly, the department and agency heads in their briefings with Malek and members of his staff were instructed to prepare and present such plans. The Select Committee has been unable to establish that any formalized plans of this nature were actually submitted to the White House. In fact, it has received evidence that the White House did not receive a single written plan from a department or agency. The experience at the Labor Department is instructive. The task of formulating labor's plan was given by Secretary James Hodgson to Lawrence Silberman, the Undersecretary of Labor, now the Deputy Attorney General. After meeting with Malik, Mr. Silberman requested that various assistant secretaries and other high labor officials submit to him their proposals as to how their operations could contribute to the president's reelection. Various plans were received, some of which are collected at Exhibit Number 14, along with certain weekly reports submitted to Silberman's office respecting activity taken to support the campaign. But no comprehensive labor plan was drafted for submission to Malik. Silberman made an attempt, but later assigned the task to his assistant, Richard Wise. Wise's unfinished handwritten draft is found at Exhibit Number 53. Silberman testified at the confirmation hearing for his present position that he felt uncomfortable about submitting an election plan to Malik and thus decided not to do so. Nonetheless, the memorandums collected at Exhibit Number 14 are instructive as to the potential for abuse that underlay the Responsiveness Program. A June 19, 1972, memorandum for the Undersecretary from Malcolm R. Lovell, Jr., the Assistant Secretary for Manpower, details how many millions of dollars, up to $185 million, from Manpower Training Services and EEA money, quote, can potentially be utilized for the purposes we discussed. The memorandum continues, quote, as we develop plans for the allocation of the discretionary funds, I will coordinate closely with you in order to get maximum beneficial utilization of these funds, end quote. However, both Mr. Silberman and Mr. Lovell have stated that the proposal for using labor funds for the purposes referenced in this memorandum was never implemented. A June 14, 1972, memorandum to the Undersecretary from George C. Gunther, Assistant Secretary for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also contains several interesting statements. Quote, Gunther, under the heading Action, stated that during the campaign period, while promulgation and modification activity must continue, no highly controversial standards, that is, cotton dust, etc., will be proposed by OSHA or by NIOSH. A thorough review with NIOSH indicates that while some criteria documents, such as on noise, will be transmitted to us during this period, neither the contents of these documents nor our handling of them here will generate any substantial controversy. While the activities of the Standards Advisory Committee on Agriculture will commence in July, the committee will concentrate on priorities and long-range planning rather than on specific standards setting during this period. Other standards advisory committees may be proposed during this period, but again, their activities will be low-keyed. End quote. Mr. Silberman stated to the Select Committee that he did not instruct Mr. Gunther to discontinue the apparent plans set forth in this paragraph. 2. Under the heading Personnel, Gunther wrote, we are drafting an outline of OSHA's recruiting and hiring plan for the next 6 months. Subject to your approval, it is our intention to provide copies of this detailed plan to the Republican National Committee and the Committee to Re-elect the President. We can then consider applicants they propose. End quote. The original document contains a no by this paragraph written by Mr. Wise to indicate his and Mr. Silberman's disapproval of this proposal. 3. Finally, Gunther stated, while I have discussed with Lee Nunn the great potential of OSHA as a sales point for fundraising and general support by employers, I do not believe the potential of this appeal is fully recognized. Your suggestions as to how to promote the advantages of 4 more years of properly managed OSHA for use in the campaign would be appreciated. End quote. No action was taken respecting this paragraph. B. Dahl, Migrant Labor Grant. One success announced by Malik to Haldeman in the June 7, 1972 Progress Report was actually resolved contrary to Malik's claim due to intransigence to White House pressure. This document contained the following statement. Senator Tower's office requested that the $2.2 million Migrant Worker Program grant be given to the pro-administration Lower Rio Grande Valley Development Council as opposed to the consortium of OEO-CAP agencies. DOL has already announced that the OEO groups have the best proposal. If the Development Council were to receive the grant, there would be a significant plus for the administration, as OEO's negative voice would be silenced, and the Council's positive feelings towards the administration could be stressed. DOL has told Power that the grant will be awarded to Tower's choice. Tower will confirm his decision this week. End quote. Summarizing this result, Malik wrote, the Department of Labor was asked to award a $2.2 million Migrant Labor Program contract in Texas to a pro-administration group. Labor had already publicly committed itself to a consortium of anti-administration OEO-CAP agencies. Labor has reversed its stand. End quote. But Labor Department records reveal that the OEO-CAP agencies were eventually funded. The project was approved on October 22, 1972, albeit at a lower rate of $1.7 million. While White House pressure caused a delay in funding, the grant did go to the group that Labor deemed superior. End quote. C. Approach to HUD. Richard Goldstein in 1972 was a special assistant to Richard Van Dusen, then Undersecretary of HUD. Mr. Goldstein has submitted an affidavit to the committee that includes the following statement. Sometime in the summer of 1972, after Mr. Malik had left the White House staff to join the committee to re-elect the president, I received a telephone call from Mr. Davidson, in the course of which he asked that the department set aside approximately $2 to $3 million that could be used in the state of California as part of the Responsiveness Program. Under Mr. Davidson's proposal, an individual whom the White House would designate but who would not be an employee of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, with an appropriate delegation of authority from the Secretary, would make the decision as to how those monies were to be committed, i.e., which cities and towns in California would receive those funds. I told Mr. Davidson that, in my judgment, such a program did not make sense, that it sounded illegal and certainly improper, and that I felt confident that HUD would not participate in such a program. I further told Mr. Davidson that if he wanted a decision from a higher authority, that I would take the matter up with Undersecretary Van Dusen. Mr. Davidson suggested that I do that. At the conclusion of my conversation with Mr. Davidson, I spoke with Undersecretary Van Dusen about the matter. He agreed and told me that HUD would in no way participate in such a program. End quote. Mr. Van Dusen has confirmed that he had the conversation with Goldstein reported in the latter's affidavit. Mr. Davidson stated to the committee's staff that he does not recall making the specific request set forth in the Goldstein affidavit. D. Difficulties with OMBE. John L. Jenkins served as director of the Office of Minority Business Enterprises, OMBE, at the Department of Commerce from August 1971 until March 1973. As indicated above, OMBE was a substantial force of federal funding for minority businessmen. Several memorandums reveal the dissatisfaction of White House and campaign officials respecting Jenkins' lack of responsiveness to campaign needs. On March 3, 1972, Malik forwarded a memorandum to Robert Brown, William Maramoto, Paul Jones, and Alex Armendariz, who were leaders in the campaign effort regarding Black and Spanish-speaking voters. This memorandum stated, quote, "Each of you has expressed concern to me recently about the use of OMBE grants. This obviously represents an excellent opportunity to make a contribution and gain headway in the Black and Spanish-speaking areas. I have discussed this situation with Ken Cole, and we are in agreement on the importance of this program to our efforts. However, if we are to be at all effective in the OMBE area, we must ensure that the White House speaks with a single voice. Ken and I are agreed that that single voice will be John Evans of the Domestic Council staff. I believe assigning John the complete responsibility in this area can be quite effective and helpful to our efforts. John has the same objectives that you do, and I am sure you will find him most receptive to your inputs and needs. In this regard, I think it would be helpful if, at an early stage, you each sat down with John to discuss the Blacks and Spanish-speaking problems, respectively, to ensure he is fully apprised of your needs and that a meaningful liaison is established." End quote. Later documents, however, indicate that the Jenkins OMBE problem was not solved. On April 11, 1972, Jones sent a memorandum to Robert Odle, which reported, quote, "We participated in meetings with White House team members to resolve problems centering around OMBE activities in efforts to assure that maximum benefits flow from this program." End quote. And on July 21, 1972, Jones sent a memorandum to Malik containing the following entry. Problem: the inability, after repeated high-level meetings, to get favorable supportive responses from the Office of Minority Business Enterprises remains a continuing obstacle to best use of administration resources to meet critical needs. End quote. Jenkins testified before the Select Committee in executive session on February 8, 1974. He stated that from time to time he received telephone calls regarding grants from Marimoto or Rodriguez concerning pro-administration, Spanish-speaking firms, and from Brown or Jones as to Blacks favorable to the administration. Jenkins testified he would inform the caller that the grants were in the process and then would proceed to follow proper procedures as laid down by legislation and regulations. He was aware, however, of the concern that he was not cooperative and of the rumors that he was not directing the money into the right hands. Jenkins testified at some length regarding the pressures brought to bear on him and his responses to them. Hirschman: "Is it not true, Mr. Jenkins, that pressures came from the White House and the Committee to re-elect the President, and the pressures took the form of influence centering around various grants and contracts awarded by your office?" Jenkins: "I suppose they would term it pressure. They would exert effort towards getting a particular proposal." Hirschman: "Did they not make it clear to you that they wanted to see grants and contracts going to firms, minority firms, who were supportive of the administration?" Jenkins: "Well, this was made in a statement, and maybe this is where my division with the White House came. We felt that even though this was made in a statement, that they still wanted us to follow the prescribed rules and regulations that had been established by the Congress to award a grant or contract to an individual firm. And that is very well where I probably fell in disfavor, if it was such, at the White House, because I did not deviate from that particular performance. And we were told that we should be very attentive to those persons and organizations who were favorable to the President. And we took that under consideration within the guidelines of the requirements and criteria." End quote. When shown memorandums critical of his performance, Jenkins said, "I would say that it was all brought about because of a few small-minded people in the White House who felt that I had not cooperated with what they wanted done." End quote. Jenkins said that he was not previously aware of the March 3rd Malik memorandum quoted above relating to the appointment of John Evans as the OMBE contact, but continued, quote, "Since I see the memo, I can see some connection, because I was giving everybody a fit over there, and Marimoto would call me, Bob would call me, Norris Seidner would call me, and I probably was not responding like they wanted me to. So it was probably a memo going to Malik saying we are not getting the juice out of OMBE that we should be getting out of it. And consequently, this memo came out, and they appointed John." End quote. Jenkins testified that he finally went to then Department of Commerce Undersecretary James Lynn to complain about the pressures on him. In a meeting attended by Muramoto, Rodriguez, Lynn, and Jenkins, Lynn explained that Jenkins had certain rules and regulations and requirements that had to be met, and that he was moving on all projects that had some viability to them. Lynn stated to the committee that certain White House staffers were impatient with Jenkins, but that he, Jenkins, was attempting to carry out his OMBE duties in a responsible manner. Part 7. Purported cancellation of the Responsiveness Program. Malik moved from the White House to the campaign as deputy director on July 1, 1972. Daniel Kingsley, still at the White House, assumed administrative responsibility for the Responsiveness Program at that time. A progress report from Kingsley to Haldeman, which the Select Committee has not obtained, apparently prompted the official, if not the actual, cancellation of the Responsiveness Program. The events leading to this cancellation are set forth in an affidavit submitted to the Select Committee by Frank Herringer, a former Malik assistant, now the administrator of the Urban Mass Transit Authority. Quote, sometime later, probably during September 1972, a carbon or Xerox copy of a progress report on the Responsiveness Project from Kingsley to Haldeman crossed my desk on its way to Malik. I do not recall any specifics of the report, but I believe it was similar to an earlier progress report which was shown to me recently and which is in the Select Committee's possession. I scanned the report, or part of it, briefly, and I recall that I was generally disturbed by the descriptions in the report of some of the individual actions that supposedly had occurred in the Responsiveness Project. While I did not believe that anything inappropriate had actually occurred, I felt that the exaggerated tone of the report, as is equally true in the earlier report, could cause someone not familiar with the general staff practice of exaggerated writing to think that inappropriate activities were being carried on. I sent the copy of the progress report along to Malik with a suggestion that he recommend to Haldeman that the project, or at least the reports, be discontinued, and possibly with a suggested draft memorandum for Malik to send to Haldeman if he agreed. A few days later, Kingsley's secretary collected from my secretary materials in Malik's and my files relating to the early stages of the development of the Responsiveness Project. As far as I can recall, that was the last I ever heard of the project." End quote. It appears that all the responsiveness documents collected by Kingsley were burned or otherwise destroyed because of their politically sensitive nature. The Select Committee obtained copies of the majority of the responsiveness documents contained in this report from CRP files of Malik and others that were preserved at the National Archives. Malik essentially confirms the account set forth in the Herringer affidavit. Malik stated to the committee that after the Watergate affair broke, he felt the campaign should be free of all conduct that might be subject to misinterpretation. It appears, however, from numerous documents the Select Committee has obtained that activities of the responsiveness type continued past September until the conclusion of the campaign. Without referencing all available documents, the committee notes a November 2, 1972, confidential memorandum from Alex Armendariz to Kenneth Cole, suggesting that La Raza Unida, a Spanish-speaking organization potentially hostile to the president, might remain neutral through the election if some of the government programs affecting its interests could be sprung loose within the next few days. 8. Discussion. Throughout its investigation of the activities described in this chapter, the Select Committee was met with the claim that this conduct is politics as usual, that other administrations have similarly employed the resources at their command to ensure the incumbent's re-election. Because the Select Committee's investigation was limited by the Senate in Senate Resolution 60 to the 1972 campaign and election, the committee cannot confirm or refute these charges. Footnote. One could, however, speculate with some confidence that no other administration was as victimized by its passion to commit its plans and stratagems for using federal resources to paper as was the present one. Of interest in this regard is a May 24, 1972, confidential eyes-only memorandum from L.J. Evans to Malick, carrying the prescription "burn before reading," by which Malick wrote, "always." Perhaps, unfortunately for those involved, many documents unearthed by the committee were not always burned before or after reading. End footnote. But to some degree, the contention that other administrations have done the same thing misses the point, for, as the discussion that follows demonstrates, certain of the activities described not only appear to contravene the fundamental notion that our nation's citizens are entitled to equal treatment under the laws, but also raise questions as to the applicability of specific federal civil and criminal statutes. It is useful to begin this discussion by referencing the admonition of the Supreme Court in the recent case of United States Civil Service Commission et al. Versus National Association of Letter Carriers, AFL-CIO et al., 413 U.S. 548 and 564 through 5, 1973. Quote, "It seems fundamental in the first place that employees in the executive branch of the government, or those working for any of its agencies, should administer the law in accordance with the will of Congress rather than in accordance with their own or the will of a political party. They are expected to enforce the law and execute the programs of the government without bias or favoritism for or against any political party or group or the members thereof. It is not only important that the government and its employees, in fact, avoid practicing political justice, but it is also critical that they appear to the public to be avoiding it if confidence in the system of representative government is not to be eroded to a disastrous extent." End quote. In this case, the Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of a portion of the Hatch Act, 5 U.S.C. 7324 A.2, which proscribes certain political activities by most federal employees. The Hatch Act, in fact, contains another broad prescription that would seem to prohibit many of the activities described above. Section 7324 A.1 of Title V provides that an employee of an executive agency may not use his official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election. Violation of this provision can result in dismissal from federal service. See 5 U.S.C. 7325. While this provision suffers from some vagueness and has never received an authoritative interpretation by the courts, its applicability must nonetheless be considered in determining the propriety of the conduct presented in this chapter. Moreover, the question is raised whether certain conduct described in this chapter may have amounted to a conspiracy to defraud the United States under 18 U.S.C. 371. The most authoritative definition of this crime appears in the Supreme Court's decision in Hammerschmidt v. United States, 265 U.S. 182, 188, 1923, Taft, Chapter J, where the court said, quote, "To conspire to defraud the United States means primarily to cheat the government out of property or money, but it also means to interfere with or obstruct one of its lawful governmental functions by deceit, craft, or trickery, or at least by means that are dishonest. It is not necessary that the government shall be subjected to property or pecuniary loss by the fraud, but only that its legitimate official action and purpose shall be defeated by misrepresentation, chicanery, or the overreaching of those charged with carrying out the governmental intention. See also E.g. Dennis v. United States, 384, U.S. 855, 861, 1966, where the court observed that Section 371, quote, reaches any conspiracy for the purpose of impairing, obstructing, or defeating the lawful functions of any department of government, end quote. Haas versus Henkel, 216 U.S. 462, 1910. Tyner versus United States, 23 U.S. APP, D.C., 1904. The evidence accumulated by the Select Committee presents the issues whether those administration and CRP officials who agreed on plans to use federal resources for political ends were engaged in a conspiracy to interfere with or obstruct lawful government functions, and whether legitimate official action and purpose was defeated by the overreaching of those charged with carrying out the governmental intention, end quote. It is also relevant that the major documents promulgating responsiveness plans were classified confidential, extremely confidential, or eyes only, and noted that secrecy in the implementation of the proposal was of paramount necessity in order to avoid adverse publicity. Thus, a question exists whether there was agreement to interfere with the lawful functions of government by deceit, craft, or trickery, or means that are dishonest. In any event, there are specific federal criminal and civil statutes that appear applicable to the conduct herein described, and, of course, any agreement to violate a federal criminal law could also be prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. 371 as a conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States. Certain criminal and civil statutes that appear relevant to the activity portrayed in this chapter are now discussed. 1. The evidence suggests that one area of emphasis in the Responsiveness Program was the allotting or rechanneling of federal money, funds for grants, contracts, loans, and subsidies to target groups and areas in order to enhance the president's reelection chances, and to individual applicants who were supportive of or would thereafter support the president. Section 595 of Title 18 makes it illegal for, quote, a person employed in any administrative position by the United States or by any department or agency thereof in connection with any activity which is financed in whole or in part by loans or grants by the United States, or any department or agency thereof, to use his official authority for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the nomination or the election of any candidate for the office of president, etc., end quote. The offense is a misdemeanor and is penalized by a fine of not more than $1,000 and or imprisonment of not more than 1 year. There are, however, no reported cases under this section. 2. The committee has received evidence raising the possibility that certain individuals were offered government benefits in exchange for political support, or at the least, political neutrality. Section 600 of Title 18 makes it a misdemeanor punishable by a fine of up to $1,000 and or imprisonment up to 1 year to promise any government benefit, quote, or any special consideration in obtaining such benefit to any person as consideration, favor, or reward for any political activity or for the support of or opposition to any candidate or any political party in connection with the federal election. 3. There is evidence that plans were laid for government officials and others to solicit campaign contributions from minority recipients of federal grants, loans, and contracts. Moreover, the committee has obtained evidence that these plans were in part consummated. It also appears from Civil Service Commission findings and otherwise that certain federal employees were solicited for campaign contributions by other federal employees on federal facilities. Several provisions of the Federal Criminal Code are relevant regarding this conduct. A. Section 611 of Title 18 provides that anyone entering into a contract with the United States for the rendition of personal services or furnishing any material, supplies, or equipment, if payment for performance of such contract or payment for such material, supplies, or equipment is made in whole or in part from funds appropriated by the Congress, may not directly or indirectly make any contribution of money or other thing of value, or promise expressly or implicitly to make any such contribution contribution to any political party, committee, or candidate for public office, or to any person for any political purpose or use. A contribution or promise to contribute is only illegal if made during the time period from the beginning of negotiation on a government contract to the completion of the contract or the termination of negotiations respecting the contract, whichever is later. It is also illegal to solicit any such contribution from any such person for any such purpose during any such period. Penalty for violation is a fine of not more than $5,000 and or imprisonment for not more than 5 years. B. Section 602 makes it criminal for an official or employee of the United States or a person receiving any salary or compensation for services from money derived from the Treasury of the United States, directly or indirectly to solicit, receive, or be in any manner concerned in soliciting or receiving any contribution for any political purpose whatever from any other such person. This statute carries a fine of up to $5,000 and or imprisonment up to 3 years. C. Section 603 makes it illegal for anyone in any room or building occupied in the discharge of official duties by any person mentioned in Section 602 to solicit or receive any contribution of money or other thing of value for any political purpose. The penalties are the same as enumerated in Section 602. D. Section 607 makes it illegal for a federal employee to give a campaign contribution to another federal employee. The penalties are the same as in Sections 602 and 603. 4. The March 17 Malik to Haldeman Memorandum, setting forth the basic precepts of the Responsiveness Program, indicates that one of the goals of that program was the shaping of legal and regulatory proceedings to benefit the President's re-election campaign. And in a Malik to Haldeman Memorandum dated June 7, 1972, Malik appears to claim that for campaign purposes, his forces achieved successful results respecting EEOC and Labor Department proceedings. Section 1505 of Title 18 provides that whoever corruptly influences, obstructs, or impedes, or endeavors to influence, obstruct, or impede the due and proper administration of the law under which a proceeding is being had before a department or agency of the United States shall be fined not more than $5,000 or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both. 5. The evidence indicates that various federal employees were actively engaged in the President's re-election campaign. It appears that some of these employees were not exempt from the provisions of the Hatch Act, 5 U.S.C. 7324 A2, which provides that an employee in an executive agency may not take an active part in political management or in political campaigns. Violation of this provision may result in dismissal from office. See 5 U.S.C. 7325. 6. The Select Committee has received evidence suggesting that White House and campaign officials, acting through special personnel referral units established in various departments and agencies, were engaged in a program to place political supporters of the administration in government positions regulated by the Civil Service Merit System, that is, competitive service positions. It is unlawful for a department or agency to make determinations on staffing for competitive service positions on the basis of political considerations. For example, Section 4.2 of Executive Order No. 10577, which was issued pursuant to 5 U.S.C. 3301, provides that, quote, no discrimination shall be exercised, threatened, or promised by any person in the executive branch of the federal government against or in favor of any employee in competitive service or any eligible or applicant for a position in the competitive service because of his political affiliation, except as may be authorized or required by law. Other similar statements of the law are found at Section 7.1 of Executive Order No. 10577, Section 9.5 of the Executive Order No. 11598, and 5 CFR 300.103 C 330.101. The committee rejects the proposition that much of the conduct described in this chapter should be viewed as acceptable political practice. The responsiveness concept involved the diverting of taxpayers' dollars from the primary goal of serving all the people to the political goal of re-electing the president. To condone such activity would display a limited understanding of the basic notion that the only acceptable governmental responsiveness is a responsiveness to the legitimate needs of the American people. Section 9. Recommendations. 1. Prosecution for violations of the existing criminal statutes set forth above, insofar as they relate to federal elections and the criminal statutory enactments recommended below, should be entrusted to the public attorney whose establishment is elsewhere recommended. The reasons supporting the committee's recommendation for a permanent public attorney are presented elsewhere in this report. 2. The Federal Elections Commission, elsewhere recommended, should be given authority to investigate and restrain violations of the federal civil and criminal statutes referred to in this chapter, insofar as those violations relate to federal elections. The commissions should also be empowered to refer evidence of such criminal violations to the public attorney. The reasons supporting the committee's recommendation for the creation of a Federal Elections Commission are presented elsewhere in this report, as are the specifics concerning the recommended powers of this commission. 3. The committee recommends that Congress enact legislation making it a felony to obstruct, impair, or pervert a government function, or attempt to obstruct, impair, or pervert a government function by defrauding the government in any manner. As indicated above, there is a question whether some of the conduct described in this chapter may have interfered with the lawful functioning of government. Certain of the endeavors described were pursued in concert. There is, for example, evidence that the governmental officials and CRP personnel acted jointly in various attempts to use federal resources for re-election purposes. As noted, there is currently in the Federal Code a statute, 18 U.S.C. 371, making it unlawful to conspire to defraud the United States. The Supreme Court has ruled that a conspiracy to interfere with the lawful functioning of government is prosecutable under this provision. The committee's recommendation, which is an elaboration of the suggested provision in Section 1301 of S. 1400, the Department of Justice bill, now pending before the Senate, would make illegal individual conduct that fraudulently interferes with a lawful government function. This recommendation, coupled with existing 18 U.S.C. 371, should cover completely all future attempts by campaign officials, government personnel, and others to use federal resources to influence a federal election in a manner that interferes with lawful government functioning. 4. The committee recommends that Congress preserve, as part of the United States Code, 18 U.S.C. 595, which makes it illegal for a government official connected with the awarding of federal grants and loans to use his official authority to effect a federal election, but recommends that this offense be upgraded to a felony. The committee recommends that 18 U.S.C. 600, which makes illegal the promise of government benefit for political support, be upgraded to a felony. The committee also recommends that the scope of Section 595 be expanded to include misuse of official authority in connection with the dispensing of other federal funds, such as government contract payments and federal subsidies. The major proposed revisions of the Criminal Code currently before Congress, S. 1, the McClellan Bill, S. 1400, the Department of Justice Bill, H.R. 10047, the Brown Commission recommendations, would either seriously limit the scope of 18 U.S.C. 595 or altogether remove its strictures from the law. This result, in view of the factual findings in this chapter and the necessity of preserving the sanctity of the electoral process, is undesirable. To the contrary, this provision and 18 U.S.C. 600 should be upgraded to felony level, better to protect the integrity of federal elections. Section 595, as now written, does not appear to deal with misconduct by certain federal officials who have important responsibilities for dispensing federal funds. For example, those dealing with government contracts and various federal subsidies. In view of the evidence uncovered, the scope of the statute should be expanded to cover conduct by these influential federal officials. 5. The committee recommends that Congress preserve in the United States Code 18 U.S.C. 611, which proscribes political contributions by or solicitations to government contractors, and 18 U.S.C. 602, which makes illegal political solicitations by persons receiving federal compensation for services rendered to other such persons, but appropriately amend these provisions to make illegal contributions by or knowing solicitations to a. any person receiving during the calendar year a contribution or solicitation is made, other federal monies, that is, grants, loans, subsidies, in excess of $5,000, and b. the principals or dominant shareholders of corporations receiving during the calendar year a contribution or solicitation is made, SBA 8A or OMBE awards, or other such federal funding designed to benefit disadvantaged and minority groups. Section 611 only makes illegal contributions by or solicitations to contractors compensated by federal dollars. It does not cover contributions by or solicitations to other recipients of significant federal funding, for example, certain grantees and loan recipients. Moreover, the statute by its terms does not seem to cover contributions by or solicitations to principals or dominant stockholders of corporations receiving federal monies. Similarly, Section 602 only covers solicitations to those receiving federal compensation for services rendered. It does not condemn solicitations to those receiving federal funding without returning services, or solicitations to the principals or dominant shareholders in corporations that receive federal monies. The evidence before the committee indicates that respecting minority groups, plans were laid to solicit recipients of grants or loans. Also, there appeared to have been particular pressures to contribute on minority businessmen whose corporations were quite dependent on government business. The law currently prohibits contributions by corporations to federal elections, and we recommended elsewhere that a $3,000 limit be placed on the amount any individual can contribute to a presidential campaign. The proposal to prohibit contributions by and knowing solicitations to the principals and dominant shareholders of corporate recipients of SBA 8A or OMBE awards or other federal funding designed to benefit disadvantaged and minority groups adds another protection to persons who are most dependent on federal funds and thus all the more susceptible to campaign solicitations by federal candidates or their representatives. The current major bills to revise the criminal code before Congress, S1, S1400, H.R. 10047, generally weaken the prescriptions in sections 602 and 611 and lessen the penalties for their violation. In view of the abuses discovered, a weakening of the law in this area seems unwise. 6. The committee recommends that Congress amend the Hatch Act to place all Justice Department officials, including the Attorney General, under its purview. The evidence the Select Committee has gathered indicates that various federal officials took an active part in the President's 1972 re-election campaign. Some of the officials apparently involved were covered by the Hatch Act, which prohibits certain federal employees from engaging in political campaigns and political management, but some were not. Some of the federal officials who engaged in political activities were employed at the Department of Justice, for example, Mr. Mitchell. Sections 7324D of Title V exempts certain Justice Department officials from Hatch Act coverage. The committee, however, believes that Justice Department officials should administer the nation's laws totally removed from all political considerations. The committee thus recommends that all Justice Department employees and officials, including the Attorney General, be placed under the Hatch Act. 7. The committee recommends that the appropriate committees of both houses of Congress, in accordance with their constitutional responsibilities, maintain a vigilant oversight of the operations of the executive branch in order to prevent abuses of governmental processes to promote success in a federal election. This proposal needs no discussion, for an obvious major lesson of Watergate is that vigorous congressional oversight of the executive branch is essential. This ends Section 27 and is the end of the final report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1.